Hello, everyone. As you can see on your slide here, we have an example of one of the threads that runs through the entire process. Naturally, this one is related to the source and use of funds. So over the next few slides, we will show a few excerpts from the various ALE forms and agreements that speak to the funding related requirements that are stated from the outset and carried all the way through. Please note this is not a comprehensive list of the relevant terms contained in these forms and agreements, but instead provide an example of how the requirements are set forth and acknowledged throughout the process so that NRCS is ultimately able to expend the federal funds on a valid easement acquired through a compliant transaction that will successfully achieve the program's conservation purposes. So as you can see on this slide in block 1 at the application phase, the entity signs the application certifying they have the resources to acquire, manage, and hold the easement. Here in block 2 at the program agreement level, they're signing again, but here they're acknowledging their responsibilities and the limitations and requirements related to the sources and uses of funds. Then in block 3, we get to the parcel contract, and here we have estimated cost information and a breakdown of the amounts and sources of funding. And at this point, we are committing funds to the project. In block 4, we have the actual statement to confirm matching funds, which will be executed prior to closing, and it provides the amounts paid for by the eligible entity and, if applicable, by the landowner. Then in block 5, we have the actual payment application, which requires the completed statement to confirm matching funds as supporting documentation. And then finally, in block 6, we have the settlement statement. And this should reflect the information provided on the statement to confirm matching funds. It won't have all of that information, but you shouldn't be seeing any conflicting information. Next slide, please. All right, during the application phase, we have the entity fill out the estimated easement value and compensation costs and the non-federal share information. So this is from the NRCS CPA 41A, the parcel application. Naturally, most of the time we don't have an appraisal at this point. So these are estimated numbers. But in block A here, we see the estimated fair market value of the easement. And in our example is $1 million. And then in block B, we have the estimated eligible entity cash contribution for payment of easement compensation to the landowner. And we see in parenthetics here that this cash is excluding any landowner donation. We also have a footnote that's important to draw out. It's at the bottom of the form and easy to overlook. So we have set it to the side here for ease of reference. And what that footnote says is the estimated eligible entity cash contribution means the amount provided by the entity for payment of easement compensation to the landowner, and it may include all sources of funds used to make such payment other than any funds provided by the landowner or the federal share. Also, this amount does not include any other costs, administrative, planning, stewardship, or non-monetary items like in-kind activities, land from another parcel, etc. So this is an important footnote to ensure our eligible entities and our landowners understand. Moving on down, in block C, we have the requested federal share, which in this example, it's a general ALE, so it cannot exceed 50% of the fair market value. So that's $500,000. And then in block D, we have our estimated purchase price, which is all the cash involved. So that's going to be the $500,000 federal share and the $250,000 non-federal share cash, totaling $750,000. In block E, we have the estimated landowner donation towards easement value, which is going to be the remainder in this case, which is a donation of $250,000. Again, we have an important footnote that's easy to overlook, so we have drawn it out here for you, and that footnote says the landowner donation towards easement value may include a qualified conservation contribution or a charitable donation. However, landowners shall not donate any part of the federal share or the eligible entity cash contribution back to the eligible entity as a condition of purchase or closing. So none of that $750,000 can be donated back to the entity. Again, a very important footnote to ensure our eligible entities and landowners understand. And then if at this point the eligible entity has not met their minimum non-federal share match requirements, they can include estimated procure costs to be paid by the eligible entity to a third party for a number of items. In our example here, they do not need to do that. They've already met their minimum non-federal share requirement, and so it's okay to leave this portion blank. However, if they were to include these items, number one, they cannot include any amounts entered here provided by the landowner. And in the end, eventually, if they did use any of these items, they would need to provide receipts. It would be estimates at this point. Another thing to point out here is in our example, they are not relying on these procured costs. And so we can leave it blank here. But when we get to the statement to confirm matching funds at the end, even if they are not relying on these costs, we are going to want them to show those and disclose all those just for transparency and accountability. Next slide, please. Moving on down the application form, we get to easement stewardship costs. Here, if the eligible entity has not met their minimum non-federal share requirement, they could include some stewardship and monitoring costs up to 2%. Again, this cannot include any amounts paid for by the landowner. And if they do this, they should be justifying it with an estimate of their expenses that they will incur over time for monitoring and enforcement. They can also propose over 2%. However, if they do that, state program managers should scrutinize that proposal, and the entity should have a thoroughly documented rationale and basis for that. And if you encounter that, you can certainly consult EPD. However, in our example here, they have made their total non-federal share minimum requirement at $500,000, as you can see in 4I there. So that was $250,000 in entity cash and $250,000 in landowner donation. Then moving down to number 5, it's asking us whether the eligible entity intends to provide at least 10% of the fair market value of the agricultural land easement in the form of a cash contribution. In our example here, they're providing $250,000, so they have provided greater than 10%. But if they were not, then we need to request additional information from the eligible entity as to their financial ability to steward and monitor the parcel. And that's because all entities must demonstrate capability and capacity requirements as an eligibility requirement. But under the 2014 Farm Bill, NRCS could use the entity's ability to provide at least the required cash contribution amount for all ACIP-Ale transactions as an indication that the entity is able to meet the capability and capacity requirements. And that was they had to provide at least 25% cash contribution of the fair market value of the easement. Where an entity is unable to provide at least 10%, because under the 18 Farm Bill, you could do a full donation where they're not providing any cash. Questions arise as to the entity's financial capacity to assume responsibility for this acquisition. NRCS has then specified in the regulation the conditions under which additional capability and capacity evidence is required, and that is when they're providing less than 10% cash contribution. And in the NRCS CPA 1268, that's the payment application, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, provides some examples of this kind of documentation you would be looking for. And then lastly, the eligible entity is self-certifying that they have the resources necessary to acquire, monitor, manage, and enforce the easement as they are signing this application. Next slide, please. Moving forward to the program agreement provisions, there's a large section on eligible entity responsibilities. And specifically here, there's a section that talks about the contribution requirements and limitations in 4C. And this specifically calls out the statement to confirm matching funds, points out that it's a standing exhibit to the agreement, and it talks about how the entity's contribution of its own cash resources cannot come from additional donations, payments, loans, or fees made by or charged to the landowner, their immediate family members, or organizations controlled or funded by them, whether through formal or informal agreements, and that they must provide NRCS a completed statement to confirm matching funds form signed by the landowner and themselves prior to closing the easement on any individual parcel contract. Also in their responsibilities, Section 6A10 talks about how the entity should pay all the costs of agricultural land easement acquisition and must operate and manage each easement in accordance with their local program, this program agreement, the terms of the parcel contract, ACEP statute and regulation, and that NRCS has no responsibility for the costs or management of the easement. Next slide, please. So next, we have the parcel contract, which the initial parcel contract consists of the NRCS CPA 1265, 1265 appendix, and the 1266. And what you see here is the NRCS CPA 1266, and we have easement cost information, which looks very similar to what we saw on the application. Again, usually here, this is still an estimate, probably don't have an appraisal yet, but in Block A, we have the estimated fair market value of the easement at $1 million. And we have the requested federal share at 50% of that and $500,000. We also have the total estimated non-federal share. So this is going to be all entity cash, all landowner donation, procure costs, whatever they're using to constitute their minimum non-federal share requirement, totaling at $500,000. Again, we have a footnote here that's important to draw out, and that footnote talks specifically about how the final amounts and sources that comprise this non-federal share that we are totaling here must be provided in the statement to confirm matching funds submitted to NRCS at a later time. And so now we are at the point where we are obligating funds. We've gone from an expression of interest at application to the entity agreeing to certain responsibilities in the agreement, and now we are committing federal funds to the project. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to walk through the statement to confirm matching funds form for the next few slides. We'll be looking specifically at the NRCS CPA 230 used for ACEP-AL transactions. However, the NRCS CPA 1279 is used for RCPP entity-held easement transactions, and it contains the same types of information and is used to accomplish the same purpose with respect to accounting for funds just under a different program. Next slide, please. So the statement to confirm matching funds, it matters for a multitude of reasons, not least of which is transparency and accountability. There's always going to be three parties to the transaction: the eligible entity, the landowner, and NRCS. And we as NRCS have to make sure that all parties involved in the transaction understand the funding sources and requirements and limitations. It also ensures program funding requirements are met. It prevents unauthorized use of federal funds. It protects the landowner, and it maintains program integrity and defensibility. Next slide, please. Other purposes include confirmation of the non-federal share contributed toward easement value and all the acquisition and stewardship related costs. It also outlines the ACEPL limits on the federal share, which is 50% the fair market value for a general ALE or 75% for an ALE grasslands of special significance. For RCPP entity held easements, the federal share percent of the fair market value limits are identified in the applicable notice of funding opportunity or NFO. But we have to keep through all this at the forefront of our mind that the federal share cannot be utilized for anything other than payment to the landowner for easement acquisition. Next slide, please. So here is a snapshot of the actual NRCS CPA 230 form, and we will walk through it here section by section. Next slide, please. So the statement to confirm matching funds, what it does is it breaks down the final amounts paid for by the eligible entity and, if applicable, by the landowner. And through its execution, it's acknowledging any landowner donation to easement value, all estimated or actual amounts of easement acquisition related costs, and stewardship and monitoring costs. Next slide, please. So here is the very first section on the statement to confirm matching funds. And if it looks familiar, it should, because if we are to reverse engineer this, we saw a very similar table in the parcel contract. And then before that, we saw a very similar table in the application. One of the differences here is now we're getting towards the end. We should have an appraisal. So we're looking at final amounts, not estimated amounts. And so in Block A, we have the appraised fair market value of the easement, which in our example is still $1 million. In Block B, we have the eligible entity cash contribution for payment of easement compensation to the landowner from the eligible entity's own cash resources, which is still $250,000. Again, we have a footnote here that it's important to draw out from the bottom. And that footnote says the final eligible entity cash contribution, item B, is limited to the amount provided by the entity for payment of easement compensation to the landowner and may include all sources of funds used to make such payment other than any funds provided by the landowner or the federal share. This amount also does not include any other costs, administrative, planning, stewardship, or non-monetary items like in-kind activities, land from another parcel, etc. Now, if that sounded familiar, it should, and that's because it is essentially the same footnote as the footnote on the parcel application form for the analogous section. So this is just part of that through line that goes all the way through the transaction, maintaining that sort of transparency and accountability. Moving on down to Block C, we have the federal share for payment of easement compensation to the landowner through the eligible entity, and that cannot exceed 50% of the fair market value. This form is for a general ALE, so again, we have $500,000 here, but another important footnote which says the federal share provided as ACEP financial assistance, item C, to the eligible entity must not be used for easement acquisition related costs, such as appraisal, survey, title, legal fees, for planning costs, such as baseline documentation, for agricultural land easement plan development, for easement monitoring or stewardship, or for any purpose other than the purchase of the agricultural land easement from the landowner. So a very important fact to keep in the forefront of our mind. The federal share can only go to the landowner for payment of easement compensation. Then moving down to Block D, we have the purchase price, which is all the cash involved, again, $750,000. And then in Block E, we have the landowner donation towards easement value, which is also $250,000 with another footnote here. And it should sound familiar because it's the same footnote essentially that was on the parcel application. And it talks about how a landowner donation toward easement value may include such qualified conservation contribution or charitable donation, but that they cannot donate any part of that $750,000 back to the eligible entity. And so, again, this is just really part of that through line through the whole transaction, part of that transparency and accountability. And with these footnotes being the same, it's important to keep in mind that the entity has several touch points to encounter this information. They have been aware and they have agreed to abide by these requirements since application, again, when executing the agreement and parcel contract. However, this could potentially be the first time the landowner could be seeing this information. They could get really far down this pathway without knowing this. And so it is our job to ensure that that does not happen. We need to make sure that they know and understand this very early in the process, since they don't necessarily have direct touch points to this information. So we need to draw it out to our eligible entities, point it out to them in the documentation, but we need to very much make sure that the landowners understand this information as well early on. Next slide, please. So in the next section down, we have the easement acquisition related costs and who they're paid by. And there's a column for the eligible entity and a column for the landowner. And footnote 4 there in section F says that for items F1 through F8, enter only the costs of the item procured from a third party for the provision of the listed report or service that meets the applicable ACIP-L requirements, and do not include in the eligible entity boxes any amounts provided by the landowner used to procure those items, or vice versa. So basically put the right amounts in the right column depending on who purchased that report or service, or who provided those funds. And I would like to point out that there really should be no blanks on this form. That just leads to ambiguity. Use zeros to indicate no contribution. And also just note how this mirrors the parcel application and furthers that through line. It's just at the parcel application phase, since the entity is not relying on these costs, we didn't need to fill that out. But here at the end, we want transparency as it relates to all the funds. And so even though they aren't relying on them, we want a full accounting of everything. And then moving down to the stewardship and monitoring costs, again, the eligible entity could include up to 2% to meet their minimum non-federal share requirement. They're not doing so in this example. In this example, we do have the landowner providing some stewardship funds. Naturally, that could not be included in any minimum non-federal share that the entity would be relying on. But in any case, if the eligible entities, including stewardship contributions, or if the landowner is, that needs to be justified again by an estimate of the expenses that they will incur over time for monitoring and enforcement. And by all means, if they're proposing over 2%, that should be scrutinized, and there should be a well-documented rationale and basis for that. Next slide, please. Now we get to the certification statements at the very end, beginning with the landowner. And this is the only document where all parties to the transaction, NRCS, the landowner, and the eligible entity, everybody signs, sort of certifying and acknowledging the sources of funds and the limitations and what is being provided by who. So it's very, very important that we ensure that everybody knows and understands the form and agrees to what has been filled out there. And so the landowner certification statement says that I certify the information on this form for the acquisition of an ACIP-Ale is true, correct, and complete. I have been informed that the dollar amount listed above is the appraised fair market value of the ALE easement, and I have agreed to grant an ALE easement on my property for $750,000. I understand that false certification has serious consequences and will result in ineligibility for ACIP. So again, it's our responsibility to make sure that they understand what they are certifying and they understand what's on the form. Next slide, please. Next, the eligible entity will sign their certification statement, which is certifying that no part of their contribution has been provided by the landowner. And so they are certifying that similarly, the information on this form for the acquisition of the easement is true, correct, and complete. They are further certifying that their own contributions and costs as listed on the form have not come from additional donations, payments, loans, or fees made by or charged to the landowner, their immediate family members, or organizations controlled or funded by them, whether through formal or informal agreements. And they are stating that they understand that false certification would have serious consequences and would result in ineligibility of the entity for ACEP. Again, only document we all sign with respect to the funding. Very important we make sure the entity understands what they are certifying. Next slide, please. Then we come to the final certification statement, and NRCS should be the last signatory on this document, and policy requires us to review this matching funds form with the landowner and the entity to ensure they understand that ACEP or RCPP does not require a donation or contributions to stewardship or easement acquisition costs, and we are certifying through the execution of this form that this discussion occurred. So this should be NRCS staff familiar with the transaction, someone who's been a part of the project. It shouldn't just be any NRCS staff that's available. It should be someone who has been a part of the acquisition process. And preferably, this is done in person, but you can do this via telephone if you're several hours away or something of that nature. But again, it's just imperative as we are talking over this form and this certification statement with the landowner to make sure they understand this certification statement and this form. It's the only one we are all signing. And so NRCS is certifying that they have communicated directly with that landowner and they have confirmed to us all of the information on the form is true, correct, and complete. And that the landowner has certified that the eligible entity's own contributions and costs as listed on the form will not come from additional donations, payments, loans, or fees made by or charged to the landowner, their immediate family members, or organizations controlled or funded by them, whether through formal or informal agreements. And that they understand that the purchase price, $750,000 in our example, is the amount that they will receive at closing for the purchase of the agricultural land easement, less any commensurate reduction to the federal share pursuant to AGI limitations. And that the grantor further understands that ACEP or RCPP does not require a landowner donation or contribution to stewardship or acquisition funds. So imperative that we ensure that they understand these things. Next slide, please. Then we get to the NRCS CPA 1268, and this is the payment application. And right here in section 1, it's asking us to enter the date NRCS signed that statement to confirm matching funds, as we should be the last signatory on the form. Next slide, please. Also on the payment application, we see here all the supporting documentation required to review and disperse the federal share. And in Block 2, we see that the completed statement to confirm matching funds is required before we can disperse the federal funds. Also in Block 6, it's a reminder that if the eligible entity is paying less than 10% cash to the landowner, then we need to get additional documentation as to their capability and capacity requirements. And there is some good examples in here of the kind of documentation that you will want to be asking from them to make that determination, to conduct that analysis. Next slide, please. Then we get to the settlement statement, and here the trail of costs and funding sources from the parcel application, the program agreement and parcel contract, the executed statement to confirm matching funds, and the final settlement statement. All of that should be easy to follow. The through lines that began an application and ran all the way through the transaction should culminate in and be confirmed by this final executed settlement statement. Now, not all the information is going to be on there or be reflected, but there just shouldn't be any conflicting information. Next slide, please. So that was quite a bit of information. So to summarize a little bit, landowner contributions to easement value, acquisition, or stewardship costs are not necessarily prohibited. However, they can never come from the federal share. In addition, landowner contributions cannot be required in any fashion, whether written, verbal, implied, or otherwise, as a condition of ASAP-AIL or RCPP funding. Next slide, please. So all that to say, any money the landowner gives to the eligible entity must be a voluntary contribution. It must be of their own free will, their own volition, and therein lies the need for the statement to confirm matching funds outlays all the costs and who paid for them, with assurances that everyone understands there are no requirements for the same as a condition for RCPP or ASAP-AIL funding. Even if the landowner is contributing something to the eligible entity that is not expressly listed on the statement to confirm matching funds form as part of or related to that specific transaction, such as staff time, then it should be disclosed in accordance with the footnotes and certification statements. Then, similar to any of the other potential contributions, donation of value, due diligence costs, stewardship, it must be made clear these are not a requirement for participation in ASAP-AIL or RCPP, and assurance is provided that the eligible entity did not require any of that through formal or informal agreements. Next slide, please. So to facilitate this understanding and to ensure adherence to statutory and regulatory requirements, there must be a clear through line. We just have to have a straight plumb line, if you will, beginning with the transaction, continuing through the program agreement and parcel contract, illustrated in the payment application, distilled and verified in the statement to confirm matching funds, and reconciled with the settlement statement to ensure no conflicting information.